and welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 62. On tonight's episode, we're going to be looking at the notion of silhouettes. A kind of really interesting idea that you can only see the outline, you can't see any of the details, so the brain starts filling in itself. So how does that apply to photography, and what can you do with it? So I thought we'd have a little look at that and kind of investigate a couple of bits on around the notion of silhouettes. What I'm also going to be talking about is photos from Morven, who's trying to sort of do some garden photography, but isn't getting that lovely kind of bokeh quality that she sees when people use macro lenses in particular. So I'm going to chat a little bit about that. Then we also have Roy was taking some photos of his granddaughters and just wasn't sure what to do with their hands. And certainly this is something that crops up a lot for portrait photographers, or when you're trying to take a photo of somebody, you don't want them sort of standing with their arms straight down and looking a bit awkward. But hands, what do you do? Long gone are the days when you could sort of just stick a cigarette and especially if it's one of your grandchildren. And then also, finally, we're going to be looking at Robert sent in this photo that he took when he was down in New Orleans, but the skin is very, very red, and he's wondering if there's things you can do with that. So these bits will be cropping up in the critique section in the second part of the programme. So my apologies now once again for suddenly disappearing on you at the beginning. Hopefully everything is all fine now. Right, so where are we at? We're live here on Facebook. Say hello, leave me a comment, and let me know where you're from as well. So if you're not already been here before. I've also got a slightly disconcerting thing in the fact that Facebook has once again changed its layout. So where the comments used to be on the left side of my screen, they're now sitting on the right side of my screen, and I can't have the little video of me playing 20 seconds behind what I'm actually saying off site. It now sits next to the comment, so I keep seeing a picture of myself making moves that I'm not actually making. The wonders of live podcasting. So I can see we've got a few people saying hello, so let's leap in. Jackie is saying evening from South Africa. John has come in from Ohio. Nuria is saying hello everyone from a sunny and beautiful Devon. Pat saying, oh, I'm on a different page, but now I can see you. Okay, but you've obviously found the right place to comment if I can read your comment. And Brian from Dumfries is saying, hi all, good to be with you again. Jackie saying, delighted it's just not just her cell phone that's frozen up. Oh, my wife Maggie says it looks all fine now. Well, that's a bit of a relief. And Benedito says good evening all. Becca says good evening all. And Mandy says good evening from Dumfries. And Roy has turned up and said hi everyone. Cool. So we have people here watching. This is all good. So what I wanted to talk about this evening then is the notion of silhouettes. And that's because also next week I'm going to set a silhouette challenge. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the podcast, so do stick around. The thing about silhouettes is if you just see an outline, you kind of can't help but try and fill in the details yourself. The brain has been primed to try and fill in information when you don't have all of it. It's an evolutionary trait. Our ancestors, not just back on the plains of the savannah, 200,000 years ago in Africa, but also even our primal selves, our pre-ape cousins, our tiny little shrew-like mammal ancestors around at the times of the dinosaurs. Essentially, if you partially see something, the ability to fill in the rest of it becomes a survival mechanism. Because either that something might be something that's going to eat you, or it might in turn be something you could eat, or it might just be irrelevant to your life. So, of course, sometimes we make huge mistakes with this. We think we've seen something which we haven't. But overall, our brain is pretty amazing at being able to sort of fill in the gaps. Now, the interesting thing with silhouettes is you can't help but try and fill in the gaps. So when I stick up a photo of this one that I've been using to trail the program, this is my friend landscape photographer Alan. We went down to the coast to do a little bit of photography, and getting near sunset, I took this photo of him silhouetted against the sunset. And other than a little bit of lens flare that's running across him, the centre of him is darkened out. We can't make out any of the details. But all of you who are watching this, who are photographers particularly, will know full well that's a photographer. That's somebody with a camera in their hand and strapped around their shoulder. You can look at it and you can go, and it's probably male, and he's not particularly heavy set, and already you can start to sort of form various notions just on the shape. He doesn't have long hair. You're already kind of creating an idea, an image of who he is, even if you've never seen him before. If you do happen to know him, then you start filling in the gaps even more. Your brain tells you the details that are going on in it. But it makes for quite interesting photos. It's really good for if you're wanting to play around with notions of minimalism, where you're not wanting to get distracted by detail, but you are wanting to play with the notion of shape and form. It also allows you to play with colour, because the thing is with silhouettes as well, is the fact that because the object or subject itself has no colour other than the black lost in the shadow, is the background then becomes important as well. Now, it doesn't have to be important. I mean, what you can do, here's a couple of test shots I did. Now, some of you may remember several months ago, I talked about a photo shoot I did where I was using edge lighting with a retired ballet dancer. And basically, I had a large softbox off to one side, just casting a line on the outline edge of her against a black backdrop. Now, that was using edge lighting. But what we also did was I played a little bit with where I placed the softbox directly behind her, so that all the light came from the softbox and she was just lost in silhouette and she formed a few shapes. Now, in the end, I didn't really use any of these photos, but I can show you some of the test shots I did. So, for example, this one. So you can clearly now see the shape and outline of somebody against a white backdrop. Now, I did put this in black and white, but again, you can tell, you get the sense it's a female shape. You get a little sense of short hair. You get the sense of a thin or athletic body. So you're getting a sense of shape and movement. Here's another one where she's now sticking her arms out, bending her body, and we're creating some really interesting shapes. And it's wonderful if you happen to have somebody who knows how to move their body and to create these extraordinary shapes, where you can just play with that notion of silhouetted outline. And here's one where we turn the softbox on its side and she sat down and we're just sort of lit in that way. And I thought this was a really interesting kind of exercise to do. Now, like I say, in the end, because of one thing and another, I used a different set of photos, didn't use these, but I wanted to show you that notion of silhouette. So silhouette can be as simple as a white, light from behind, a wall of light, and just the shadow. So you can do it as straightforwardly as black and white as you want. But sometimes silhouettes occur in a setting and it becomes kind of a little bit more interesting. So let me just close a couple of those and open this one. Now, here what we had was, this was when I was in Morocco, and we had this fantastic trip out into the Sahara Desert, stayed overnight camping in the desert, and were there at the sunrise in the morning. And leaping out and charging around with my camera, jumping in and out of dunes, I managed to get these camels against standing there watching the sun rising up. Now, playing around with different camera settings, I wanted to try and get some of the sand. I didn't want all of the dunes completely lost in silhouette, so the sun ended up being too bright. If I sort of speeded up the shutter speed and made the aperture smaller enough so that the sun could essentially be seen, then there would be no detail in the foreground at all. But while I've managed to get the nice shape of the sand dunes, what's happened is the camels themselves are silhouetted, and I really like that idea of just having the outline of the camels against the sky. Or alternatively, I mean, other ideas here. Let's see. I mean, you can, Here's one where it was an early morning, a very early morning, misty morning. The sun, golden sun, just sort of coming through the mist. You get a swan silhouetted. You can see the golden light is reflecting off the water. You've got it all in the mist, but the swan itself is in shadow. Because like all these things, what's happening is in order to create the silhouette, the light has to be behind the subject. Now, sunset one, by comparison, I'll show you a couple of different sunsets ones. We have like this. This was taken at a festival, Eden Festival in southwest Scotland. Sun was going down, and there were all these tents. Some of them might have even been yurts as well in a certain corner of the festival where people were paying extra to stay in a yurt. But getting that sort of skyline, almost a kind of tent city, as the sun was disappearing. By contrast, this one here, another sunset, sun just disappearing over the horizon, glorious sky, and a tree. It's obviously taken in the middle of winter when there's no leaves, but that all the detail, the wonderful outlines of every single branch just really stand out. The fact that you can't see, say, the texture of the bark feels much less important. So the point with this, though, is that the background itself then becomes a highly important part of the picture. The picture is as much about the background as it is about the silhouette, and it's that combination of how they combine silhouette and background that becomes the really important and fun part of what we're doing with photography. Then one other thing to show you here as well is some of you may remember, again, a few months back, I think I talked about the shoot I did with Jeff Forrest, who created these steel sculptures of hares, rabbit type hares rather than head type hares. And I deliberately shot them against the sunset in order to create a silhouette effect. Because these sculptures are done shaped, where he's just creating shapes with bent steel and essentially hollow so you can see through them. The very first time I saw them, I thought you need to have a backlight in that so that you're getting that fantastic silhouette against the light of the sun. So we had that one and this one just as the sun had disappeared over the horizon. Of course, the problem is with the silhouette in this case is that you do have part of the headland also running straight through the middle of the hair. That's all just blacked out. But I don't think it really matters. I still think it was quite interesting because you can tell that obviously the hair is sitting forward from the headland. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you with this idea of silhouettes. You can have a lot of fun with placing people or objects against the light. Now, it's slightly different from just the notion of backlighting. I use backlighting a lot. I've talked before about backlighting. I will no doubt talk a lot again about backlighting. The thing is, when I'm usually talking about backlighting, I'm also talking about a certain level of front lighting as well, whether that's reflected light or I'm using fill-in lights or flashes or something like that. And what I'm doing, you can see the subject. The subject isn't lost in silhouetted shadow, but I've got an extra light behind them, sometimes using sunlight, in order to create particular effects around the edging of behind their head or shoulder, or create extra layers of light within it. But if you've only got the backlight, then you end up with a silhouette. Another term for this quite often is called contre-jour, which literally means against the day. And contre-jour is one of these, sometimes on some of these online photo competitions, you'll see contrajoule. Generally what that means is that the light source is behind the subject. And the other thing, part of that being that you can kind of see the light source, whether it's a softbox or it's a sunset or it's a bright piece of sky, is that the light behind becomes part of the feature of the photo. So I think that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with that. Actually, there's another aspect to this where you can have fun with photos that maybe even set against a dull sky, you can maybe add a bit of colour into. But before I do that, I'll just double check just in case there's any comments come in that I need to respond to. What have we got here? We've got a few more coming in, saying go. Ben saying good evening from Edinburgh. Stacey says a little bit late getting in some thunder and lightning. Oh, but it's been over 90 degrees here in Pennsylvania. Robert says howdy all from Texas. Benedito says reminds me of Tales of the Unexpected. Now I'm showing my age. And John says he really likes the tree silhouette shot. It is one of those that tends to do quite well in the online competitions as well. So so the other thing I wanted to show you then was that sometimes you can have a little bit of fun with photos. So where you actually decide to add a bit of colour as well. If you've got so let me show you this photo. So I took this one back last autumn, I think, and it was a misty day, but the sun was just sort of kind of creeping through the mist. I took the photo, actually I think it was just across the road, this dead plant with really interesting, I loved the kind of little bits of detail in the outline, and it was just an interesting sort of virtually abstract shape. There wasn't a lot of colour in it because it was a grey misty day. There was a little bit of colour in the plant, but not enough to really make it worthwhile. So I put it into black and white. However, something that's worth thinking about if you end up with a picture like this is that you can add colour to it afterwards very easily in most editing programs. So if I just open this with Photoshop, now what you can do here is you can create a gradient map. Now normally what we've got is if I go over here and I select gradient map, it's black and white, and it just makes it sort of slightly deeper and black and whiter. But what I can do is I can change the color of this. So say I decide to make this a kind of orangey yellow, and okay, sorry, I need to change that again. So let's do that. Find this kind of orangey yellow. Now, I mean, I could make it any color. I could make it red, or I could make it green. But just for the sake of it, I'm gonna sort of go for like a slightly orangish kind of yellow, like that. And then if I use the gradient map, just reverse that. Otherwise, it's going to come out looking like a negative. And then use the gradient map. You see, you can now have something which looks more like a kind of a sunset silhouette or a sunrise silhouette, which I think makes it quite interesting. I could change that color into, and let's go to where else, like properties, and if I double click on that, I could shift this, make it brown. Actually, let's just go up here and I could make it red, green, teal, turquoise, indigo, purple, pink. So relatively easily you can just sort of play around and get just the kind of tone you want out of it, and that's just purely using a gradient map. So sometimes it's worth playing around. So if you're again, some of these online competitions, sometimes they do like the color yellow or something, or sunset silhouettes or things like that. So you can kind of add a little bit more color in with that. I mean, another one I did recently, 2 weeks ago, you may remember I was talking about dandelions in the garden. And I showed you this photo using the macro shot. Now, it's not fully silhouette because we can look in here and we can see where the light is actually hitting some of these seed bits, but it is quite largely silhouette. And again, using pretty much the same technique, I can take the, well, or another way of doing it is, yeah, what I wanted to show is, so if I create a new layer here, and we'll take the same color that we did with the last one, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a gradient. I'm going to use the gradient tool. Now, normally on a gradient tool, you might get it sort of moves from one color to the other, but I've got other options here where I can make a circular gradient tool like that. Now, what if I sort of place that sort of slightly behind the center of this dandelion and just sort of stretch it out, so I end up with that. Then what we can do is we can play with the options of how this layer interacts with the layer below. And in Photoshop, we come up to here in the layers options, and I'm going to run through some of these and just show you. So darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn. Now, not all of them work. I mean, that feels almost like a kind of inverse thing. Screen, now that's kind of strange. That feels like there's sunlight behind it and the sunlight is creeping through and sort of almost lighting it up from behind. Color dodge, looks quite interesting too. Overlay, now that's quite interesting because it's now the dark has sort of become a little bit blue up in the corner there, creating a contrast between the yellow in the center and the sort of blue on the outside. Soft light, just a softer version of that. Hard light. So you can see that actually there's a whole bunch of different ways you can actually play with just a color overlay. And I think probably, I quite like that. Multiply was quite good. There was another one in here, I'm sure I quite did it for me. Even color dodge is kind of fun. But yeah, something like that. So now what we've done is we've added color into it by using a simple gradient map or using the fill gradient tool in Photoshop. So that's really kind of what I wanted to show you. The notion that you can play with silhouettes, I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's worth going at. Now, one of the things I do have to say straight away, actually I should have said it probably at the beginning, which is if you are pointing your camera towards the sun, for goodness sake, do not look straight through the lens, straight through the viewfinder. Because essentially your lens is a magnifying glass, and that's like looking at the sun with a magnifying glass up to your eye, and you are going to fry the back of your eyes. You can make yourself go blind, you can certainly damage your eyes. So under no circumstances should you be, if you are pointing your camera at the sun to do something like this, then either use the viewfinder on screen. You know, that's fine. You know, you can look at the screen. The worst that's going to happen is the screen is going to get white. But don't look through the little glass eye viewfinder part. Just look at the screen. To do it. Otherwise, line it up roughly and take your best shot and then look in the back of the screen to see whether you got it lined as you want. But under no circumstances should you ever point your camera directly at the sun, just looking with your naked eye through the viewfinder. So yes, as long as you remember that. I probably didn't have to tell any. I'm sure all of you are completely sensible enough to have known that already, but it's always worth saying. I don't want anybody going blind and then me getting sued by relatives saying, but Kim said. So that's the caveat. But I think silhouettes are a lot of fun. And if you're talking about that notion of creating photos which become engaging with the audience, back to that bit that I said earlier, is that you kind of feel you can't help but want to fill in the details. I think that's a wonderful thing. So when somebody sees a silhouette, their brain automatically goes into, oh, I can see a shape. What would be going on in the black part? And because they've done that, they are now looking at the photo longer than they would have otherwise. So you can use it as a bit of a trick to kind of create a little bit more of engagement. Obviously, if there isn't enough going on, it's still not going to work. But it does become an interesting one. But you also have to bear in mind that it's not just the shape of the silhouette, it's the background, and whether the background is enhancing or detracting from the shape that you're trying to get out of the silhouette. So that's what I wanted to say about that. I hope you found that interesting. Right, and okay, so let me now close that and close that and come back to close a few more of these and see if we've got any more comments. Maggie says interesting effects. Ben says, can you damage a camera sensor by pointing it directly at the sun? And Benedito has come straight in and said yes on a long exposure if you did. But more damage is caused by leaving cameras in high heat and direct sun. Okay, well, thanks, Benedito. You pretty much answered that one. Yeah, I mean, if you're just taking quick shots, and the reality is, if you are pointing the camera that amount of light, you're going to end up having to do shutter speeds of in excess of 1,000th of a second, or maybe 2,000th or 4,000ths of a second. Very, very high shutter speed. The exposure to the sensor is very, very small. If you were wanting to do long exposure photos, sometimes you see these the sort of like sunset with soft, creamy, milky, or even foggy water, these long exposure sunsets. But at that point, what's happened is people have put neutral density filters over the front of the lens, which essentially acts like almost welding glass, or welders, like the glass welders would use, or very thick sunglasses, in order to stop too much light getting into the sensor. So if you were determined to try and ruin your sensor, yes, open up your aperture as wide as possible, stick your exposure on a 20-second exposure. I mean, the point is you wouldn't get a photo. Everything would be whited out, and then you would probably fry the sensor. But generally speaking, no, you've got more worry about frying your eyes, I think. Okay, Ben says, when you are setting up the shot, isn't the sensor exposed to the light? No, well, mind you, having said that, that's on DSLRs, it's not. Because what's happening with the DSLR is the mirror is in front of the sensor. No, I think it's probably fine. Or Benedito says only mirrorless. Okay, you got me there. I'm less sure of the mechanics of this. I'm not totally sure that the sensor is exposed when you're setting up the shot, because if it was exposed all the time, then you wouldn't be able to take a shot. It would be on permanent exposure. There has to be something. When you go click, you are opening a point where the light can get in onto the sensor, and then you're closing it again. That's what creates the photo, is the amount of light that's exposed to the sensor, and we are controlling that amount of light by the width of the aperture, by the shutter speed that we're using. So there's a protection against the sensor until it needs to be used. So I'm pretty certain you should be fine while you're setting it up. It's just really a case of not having a slow shutter speed with it. Okay, Ben says that makes sense, because on an SLR, direct light is what you look at. Yeah, the thing is with an SLR is when you look through the viewfinder, it's going down a bit like a periscope, or it is hitting the mirror and going out through the lens. You are seeing directly through that, and then when you take the picture, the mirror moves up to allow the light to come onto the sensor. Right, okay, so hope you found that bit interesting. I think like I say, don't ever look directly into the sun via your camera, but I think you can have a lot of fun playing with silhouettes. And even if it's a dull day or misty day, so you've got a bit of light coming through, then and you end up with, say, a black and white photo. The black and white can certainly be fun, but through the things that I was showing you a little bit earlier in Photoshop, you can have fun adding colour too if you want. Okay. Right. Okay, so let's move on then. So what we're going to talk about now is the critique section. So this is your chance to stick images in and get feedback and deal with to look at, try and get past your sticking points. There aren't that many places on the internet where you can get good feedback on your photos. The problem is that when we sort of tend to stick our photos up on places like Facebook and most social media, is we get all the praise from people telling us how wonderful we are and they're all being nice, but they're not professional photographers and they don't necessarily know what they're looking at, and they're trying to be kind, which is really nice, but it doesn't necessarily help us improve our photography at all. So if you haven't already joined the Facebook group Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. You can put your photos in for critique. Let me know what your sticking point is, and the following week I will have a go at seeing if I can help you pass that. So tonight we've had 3 different people put in images, and what we're going to talk, so the first one we're going to look at is Morven. So Morven put in this photo, and what she said was, I took taken on my Nikon 5500, so all auto settings, but with a regular 70 to 300 5.6 lens. I like this pic, but it does not have the softness around the edges that it would have had I taken it in manual with a macro lens. Why do macro lenses have that softness depending on where you focus, and is there any way round it? Okay, so there's kind of 2 things going on here when you're talking about, really what you're talking about is the quality of the softness, the quality of the out of focusness, the bokeh in the background compared with the sharpness of the object in the foreground. Now, I think with this one, it doesn't really look quite as sharp as it could. As if I zoom in a little bit, it does look a little bit out of focus. I think that the first thing you need to do is try and make sure that the actual subject that you've pointed at is as sharp as it's going to be, that you've got the focus right on the place that you want it. That then creates the contrast between it and the out of focus parts. Now, some lenses create a more interesting quality of bokeh behind them. Sometimes they're more expensive lenses. But there's also to do with, the other part of it is to do with your aperture. And this is really where it comes into it, is the wider your aperture, the shallow your depth of focus. So the more out of focus it becomes more quickly. So what I'm going to do, I showed this one, I don't know, about 10 weeks ago, something like that. Just to show, I'll take you through a set of photos I did, where what I did was I lined up a bunch of cones on a bench. Each one is roughly about a foot-ish apart. But what we're doing is we're looking down the length of them. No, probably not as much as a foot, probably about, actually probably about 6 or 7 inches apart. Anyway, we're looking down the length, and what I've done is I've focused the camera on the middle one. And in this case, what I'm using is I've put a 50mm lens onto the front of my camera, and my 50mm lens allows me to go to an aperture of f1.8, and that's quite a wide aperture, and what that means is you have a very narrow depth of focus. So where you can notice it here, you can see this in focus, but if you actually look at the table itself, you can see that the bench itself is that there's only a little bit which is in focus. It's a few millimeters, half a centimeter or something, which is in focus before it starts moving out of focus at either end. And what we find is the cones either side are really quite out of focus. The cones even further back are even more out of focus, and by the time you get down there, you can barely make out what's going on at all. Now, if I narrow that aperture a little bit to f2.8, you can see that if you notice particularly, say, the second cone here, it comes slightly more into focus, okay? Not vast amounts, but enough. It's starting to make a difference. If I narrow that aperture a bit more to 5.6, now it's coming much more into focus. Again, we can still, as we zoom in, we can still see it's out of focus. But again, if you look down at the table here, the amount of table that is in focus is considerably more than it was when we were at f1.8. If I widen the aperture to f8, we've now got more table in focus, cones are more in focus. I go to f11, f16, f22. Now f22, the aperture has become really small and we've got a deep depth of focus. And at this point, whilst the windows on the buildings behind aren't exactly in focus, they're in focus enough for us to see very clearly what they are. Whereas when we go back to f.1, all we can do is make out a rough, darker patch there. We can't actually make out anything else. So what's happening here is the higher your f number, which is a narrower aperture, the more in focus everything else becomes. So if you're wanting the interesting bokeh, if you're wanting that really soft background, then the way to do that is to have as wide an aperture as you possibly can. And the wider the aperture, the more it will allow that to happen. Now, you say that I think you said the lens you're using, while a 70-300, now normally a zoom lens sort of compresses that even more. So actually, if you zoom in on then an f5.6 on a 200mm lens will be as narrow as a f2.8 or even less on a sort of a much a wider aperture. On a shorter lens. So the more you zoom in, the more you sort of squish down the depth of field with it. However, I suspect that in order to be, if you're standing there with a 70-300mm lens taking a look straight down at a dandelion head, you're not going to be on full 300mm. You're probably going to be back at 70, which isn't too far off the 50 that we've got here. And the 50 that we've got on here, if we go to f5.6, is more like this. So you can see it's got, certainly the back is out of focus, but it's not got that nice creamy, beautiful bokeh that, say, the f1.8 has. Now, were you to stand further back and zoom right in with your 300mm, you may well get much more of that. But for that, because 300mm is quite a big, telephoto length, you're going to have to stand quite a long way back in order to take it. Standing above and looking straight down, you're not going to be able to manage it. And what a macro lens does is a macro lens sometimes has quite a wide aperture, but also a lot of them, so my macro lens is a 100mm, so it's already zoomed in. So it's already zoomed in twice as far as my 50mm lens, and I can have quite a wide aperture with it as well. So if we combine all this and the fact that it allows me to get up really close, I can get to within about a few centimetres of the subject. So I can get in really close and I have my aperture wide, which means everything else becomes really out of focus behind it. And a photo I took just the other day in the garden, I noticed these grasses, and what we can see here is these parts are really sharp. So I've just locked on to some of the grasses, and what's happened is all the rest of the grasses that were about, anything that wasn't directly on that plane, is out of focus. So this grass, this line here, not too far behind, I mean only a few centimetres behind, but you can see it's already gone out of focus. A few centimetres behind that and it's now going very out of focus, and a foot or two behind and it's so out of focus that you can't make out anything. But what it's allowed is, because it's so layered, all these grasses are so layered, is that you get all these kind of echoes happening behind it, and it becomes this really kind of rich layered effect. But it works because the thing that I'm actually focused on is really sharp, and then everything else has gone out of focus. But in order to do that, then the whole point is the macro lens allows you to have that wider aperture effect where everything sort of drops more out of focus more quickly. So I hope that kind of answers you, Morven. And if you wanted to sort of do that with your 70 to 300 mm lens, you could get maybe a similar kind of effect, but you will have to stand much further back. Try it with a branch with some leaves that's at the end of the garden or something like that. Get in as close as you can where you can still get it in focus, but focus on one leaf and you will find that the leaves behind will fall out of focus, and get your aperture as wide as possible. So, hope you found that one useful, Morven. Right, I'll just close those. And right. Okay. So, what we're going to do now then is, next up we had Roy. And Roy put in a couple of pictures of his granddaughters. So let's just show you that. Here's one, and here's the next. And what Roy said was, "Hi Kim, some advice please. I'm kind of happy with these photos of my two grandchildren, but I always struggle with posing, especially what to do with the hands. Any advice?" And you can kind of see it here. There's a sort of sense, I recognise this in that sense of you're taking a photo of your grandchild or whatever, and you say, okay, you don't want your arms just sort of hanging down at your sides here. It just looks wrong. Do something with your hands. Oh, well, what am I supposed to do? Fold your arms, stick one hand on the shoulder. And the problem is that there's an awkwardness to it because it's not natural and it doesn't look natural. And the person who's being photographed feels that it's not natural and so starts to feel self-conscious. Some of that self-consciousness starts to show itself in the face. And you can see it on her face. She's got this sort of slight bit where her mouth is smiling but her eyes aren't. Because she's not sure. She wants to help Grandad. She wants to, the fact that she's in front of the camera and has agreed to it at all means that she's happy to be there, except for the fact that she doesn't really know what she's doing and she doesn't want to mess it up for you. So she's following your instruction. The problem is you're not entirely sure how to instruct her. Now, I think the big problem with hands is, well, it's back to this notion of naturalness or unnaturalness. Now, there are some, sometimes you see models in magazines and they're showing off stuff and they're doing sort of strange things with their hands up here and over here. And, these are very stylized, very posed photos done in a kind of glamour advertising way, which on a 10-year-old girl is just going to look weird. It's just not going to look right. It doesn't. In fact, it can be easily argued it doesn't really look right on these models either. But there's a stylistic way of it. There's a history of it in a way. So there's certain tropes and ways of being in certain styles of photography where that's acceptable. But if you're trying to create a sort of naturalistic photo of someone, then you don't try and do these funny poses with the hands. The thing really here is it's about trying to be as natural as possible. And okay, photography, if you are getting someone to pose for the camera, it's not natural, but you want to try and introduce as many natural elements as possible. So one of the easiest things to do, quite straightforwardly, is hold something. I mean, the second one. Now, she's holding the leaf there. The problem is because she's holding the leaf in that way, it draws all your attention there as though this is something really important. But actually, it's only a leaf. But it's almost like that kind of, and allow me to introduce you to this leaf that's really important. And so it's not quite right. I mean, it works better than the other one with her arms up, round and what have you. It's still not fully right. But if you've got somebody holding something a little bit more naturally that they would, but maybe they've got a cup or a mug. Really, I suppose it's a case of trying to photograph them in a slightly more natural situation. What would they be doing? Or maybe you just go head and shoulders shot. If the hands are too awkward, if you're not really wanting the full body, just go for the head and shoulders. Another option is if people are seated. You could have them seated at a table, and then you can have hands resting on the table. You can even have hands sort of, resting under the chin. The other thing to do is to play and exaggerate with the hands. So sometimes you can do that kind of thing where you actually have somebody pointing at the camera like this, and so that whole foreshortening effect of so the hand up front becomes huge, or you can do hands coming out and grabbing, and then you're kind of framing the face within. So you can sort of play with that idea. You can have, I don't have the hair for it, but pulling up the hair, pulling it in funny circles, making faces. Maybe in my case I kind of pull the beard off in different directions. So you can make a feature of the thing is that you get the hands doing something as part of play, or doing something which is a little bit more natural. Taking if one of your granddaughters was sitting at a bench outside and was colouring in some colouring book, felt pens, colour pencils, you could have her there, and then she glances up, looks into the camera, and that has a feeling like she stopped in the middle of something she was doing in order to look at you. And that can be a really nice thing. But really, I suppose the real thing here, Roy, is that there are very few ways to naturally, or to pose the hands that don't look unnatural unless you're kind of doing it naturally. I don't know, that feels like a mouthful there. You're wanting it to look as natural as possible, so you need the hands to be doing something that they would be doing naturally, is really what I mean. So the pose is one of these things. Some people talk about not liking posed photos, and yet virtually all photos are posed. Well, portrait style photos are posed. But it's what we don't like about posed photos is photos that look posed. And they look posed because they feel inauthentic. And if somebody's sort of there not sure quite where they're supposed to be sticking their hand, that feels unnatural and that feels posed. If you've got somebody there and they're leaning on a table and they're just kind of, pushing their hand up in the way that they might normally, or they're holding a mug, or they're holding their glass, then that just looks more natural. You don't worry so much about that. Or likewise, I say, you play with hands. You have hands coming towards the camera, or holding things, or pulling hair out, or gesturing. And then that becomes a kind of, that is the act of play with the camera as well. So I hope that gives you a few ideas, Roy. Great. Okay, let's close those. And what else have we got here? A couple of comments. Nuria said maybe hold a book or a soft toy instead of standing, and maybe sit down. Yeah, that idea again. Sitting down, trying to be a bit more natural, holding something. Yeah, absolutely. Stacey also says favourite toy or petting an animal. Yeah, interaction with something else. Oh, Michelle's here. Sorry I'm late. Hi everyone. I've been on another course. I've been on a course another 2 weeks, and I will be able to join at the beginning. Russ said sorry, he's doing orders from the weekend. Russ seems to be incredibly busy at the moment. So anyway, that's great that he's got the work. Hope he can catch up on the recorded versions. Stacey says either way they are cute, and Roy says thanks Kim. Cool. Okay, so on to the last one of the evening that I'm going to talk about in the critique section before I talk about next week's challenge, and that is Robert. So Robert was down in New Orleans in Louisiana and said, during the last podcast I was in New Orleans, Louisiana, and took a ton of photos. As a gentleman named Jaron allowed me to photograph him, and I'm having difficulty with the post-processing. I think the colour is too red. So let's just show you the photo that Robert is talking about. And yes, there is definitely a sense of whether he's sunburnt or it's just the white balance hasn't quite known how to handle things. I mean, there's a really bright green door, or pair of green doors behind him, and then this sort of terracotta red, or sort of pinkish red behind his head as well. And it's almost like the white balance on the sense the camera hasn't known quite how to balance it, and there's extra kind of red into the skin there, and it just kind of looks a bit overdone. So Robert then says, oh, so I also tried playing it with black and white, and here's a version of the black and white that he did. I also think that when taking the photo, I used portrait rather than landscape to capture the images. I think I should have done both in retrospect. Let me know what you think I could do to correct the colour or make the black and white pop. Thank you. Okay, so I think the great thing about black and white is the black and white gets rid of skin variations, and we can't tell in the black and white that he was looking very red in the way that he did in the colour version. So black and white is very forgiving in that sense. So it's another one to remember if you are taking photos of people and they have sort of slightly more patchy, blotchy skin or red patches and what have you. If you are struggling, black and white is always a good way to go. So what I wanted to do, let's start with. Okay, so let's go back here and open that with Photoshop. Now there are a whole number of different kind of things you can do. You say dropping into black and white is one, but there's variations. I'll show you a couple of variations of things you can do there in a minute. But first of all, is there a kind of quick and easy way to reduce the red in the skin? And when you're talking about, at the very least, kind of Caucasian male, and female for that matter, skin tones tend to, while they, white, but really that means pink, but it sort of moves between a kind of reddish pink and a sort of slightly yellowy brown as well. And in this case, what's happened is the pink has become too dominant. Now, the first thing I'm tempted to do with this actually is just crop it slightly differently. It feels like there's a huge amount of stuff going on to the left of him here, which isn't really. So at the very least, you might pull it in. You might want to tilt it, straighten the background, something like that. If you preferred his head straight up, at the very least, I would pull that in a little bit, something like that. That just sort of feels like a slightly better crop, given the fact that his head is turned slightly to his left, our right, as we look at it. Having all that space over to his left or our left, his right, just kind of felt a bit too much. Now, like I say, part of the problem here is there's kind of a bit too much red, and we can. I mean, let's just duplicate that layer to begin with, just so that I can play around with it. One of the things, I mean, if I go to Camera Raw Filter, and just very quickly play with the color balance and see whether this would be my first choice. Now up here we can, if I shift it into the yellow, it just kind of becomes a bit too red that way, so maybe not so much that way. Then we can go more purple, or we can drop into, okay, if I pull it back into the green a little bit, maybe into the yellow a little bit, that sort of softens it a little. I mean, it's doing strange things with the background, but we do still have this reddish bit here. Okay, that's not necessarily working. I mean, it's worked a bit, but it does feel like we've still got patches of red on there. Now, another option here is to go to if I go to the hue saturation and I choose reds, and then basically just start to desaturate the reds. And to take that slightly, if I push it up, it oversaturates, and if I pull it down, that kind of softens it a little bit as well. We run the risk of his skin turning a little bit grey there, though. Another option is actually the vibrancy tool as well, because vibrance is another one where as we push it, it's not quite as hard as the saturation, where everything sort of goes black and white or fully saturated. But it does play with certain colours, which if you can see here actually intensifies the red. And if I move this over to the left a bit, that's not bad. That kind of softens it somewhat like that. And then maybe, so you can see that that kind of lightens it a little bit. Maybe if we go back to this version and then soften that a little bit. And now I think we're kind of getting to something whereby you're not feeling that he's over red with that. So as a very kind of, now what you can also do with that is you can, if you felt that the background colors had been lost with this, you just use the masking, in this case actually we need to turn black and essentially paint the original colors back in a little bit more, but that's kind of up to you as to how much you want to do it. Now once we're into this level, that it's then a case of how far you want to take it. This is the kind of quick and easy solution. You can, from this point, if I select all, copy, paste that up there. So we're now starting here and we've now got little patches of red rather than the whole thing being red. We can go into the hue saturation level, choose the reds. Only what we might do here is, let's just shift, I'm going to slide these over so we've got completely different colours and the saturation point here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the bottom bit left and right here until what we can do is we see that it's only really happening in the places where it was overly red. So something like here. Now what I might do is just take these, narrow them down a little bit, something like that. And so now we've got this bit. It's only really showing up where it was overly red. If I take these levels back to 0, now what I can do is I can desaturate. Sorry, I'll take that to 0. I can desaturate just those red areas that were 2. You see, if I push that up, that's where there we go. So now I can just pull that down and that softens it again. So we've kind of gone from there to there. Maybe we've taken a little bit too much out of the lips. So again, we might want to just paint the lips back in, but that's kind of up to you. So you can see now that depending on how many stages and layers you want to go, he now doesn't look anything like as red as he used to. So just to show you essentially the quick before and after. Now in terms of going black and white, again there's things to play with. I mean, because your traditional way of going black and white, maybe you want to do a black and white gradient map, and when we find that, he ends up being quite dark with that. So maybe not quite so happy with that option. If you go to, so you can go to hue saturation and desaturate. He's still fairly dark, but it's maybe not so bad. At that point, maybe you can take the curves and you can lighten him up a bit, create a little bit more contrast, depending on how you want to play with that. Another option, for those who remember that a few weeks ago we were talking about playing with channels. How you have the blue channel, the green channel, and the red channel. And the red channel is the most forgiving of all channels because it essentially, the red doesn't register, it becomes much whiter in this, and so smooths out again. So what I could do, I'll just copy that, come back into here, and I'm going to paste it on here. Now maybe that I don't want all of that, so let's come out of here. Let's say we went to just a straightforward desaturation, but then overlaid that. And then what I can do is I can nudge this up a little bit, from there, take the slider up. Maybe, that's too far. So we just kind of find a point whereby you think, actually, I quite like that. And if you prefer the background of the other, then we just mask it and again paint the original background back in. Something like that. And then again, if you want, you can go in and you can play with whatever curves you might want to do in order to create a little bit more contrast or a little less, depending on your taste and how you feel about it. But hopefully that gives you some ideas, Robert. So you using the sort of the reds and then sort of selecting particular reds and narrowing it down a bit, you can really use the hue saturation just to get rid of the problem points, but also play around a little bit with shifting the skin color a little bit over out of the reds in the first place, slightly more kind of yellowy green rather than purple and blue, if you know what I mean, as I did. And then in black and white, the red channel is always worth playing around with, although it does sometimes kind of blow out other reds that you don't want, so you can use masking levels. So I hope that helps. I hope that gives you some ideas to start playing with. And like I said, the rest of it is go in and play. These are just starting points. The recorded version of this will be up on YouTube, so you can always go back and watch it again, pause it, freeze it. And then if you still have problems, zap me an email and say, well, I got this far, but then that didn't seem to make sense. Can you explain a bit further? And I'll do my best to help. Right, well, I hope that was useful. So where are we now? A couple more comments here. Pat is saying to Roy, with regard to photographing the grandchildren, engage her in conversation till she is relaxed and then choose your moment. I know nothing about photography, but a bit about being taken. And that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And Pat does know what she's talking about, because Pat used to be a model. And I photographed Pat myself. He's a wonderful model, wonderful person to photograph. But Pat was one of these models back in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, I think it was more, but you can correct me with that, Pat. But there's I've seen some fantastic photos. You know, the kind of photos where you, or even the illustrations where you have sort of late 1950s, early 1960s, woman with a big white smile holding up the toothpaste. Pat did a lot of these kind of things as well. Beautiful, wonderful photos. And yeah, the main thing when you're photographing anybody is trying to find ways to relax them. And it's one of these things where we talked before about the problems of portraiture, is that portraits inevitably mean engaging with the person you're photographing, and the person you're photographing could be feeling uncomfortable. If you're uncomfortable and you don't know what you're doing with your camera, that can spread across as well, so that the other person starts to feel even more nervous, and then all you end up is with grimaces on the face. But the fact is, your granddaughters will want to help you out. So you need to have fun with them, you need to relax them, chat with them, explore. Let them have some ideas as well. Kids are incredibly imaginative. Engage them. Start with some ideas and say, well, what would you like to do with this? Let's have some ideas. Do you have any toys that you would like to bring in? Do you have any activities you think we should try out? Chances are one or both of them is going to come up with some kind of idea, and then go with them, ride their energy is probably one of the best things to do. So yeah, thanks for that input, Pat. That's really good. Stacey says she loves New Orleans and was there after the hurricane and floods. The French Quarter is beautiful to shoot. Stacey prefers also the black and white. John agreed with that. So did Naria. Robert saying that looks much better. I'm glad. Stacey says it's off on the red. Benedito says I like the black and white filter as it has a hue variation control. Yeah, depending on the excuse me, depending on the program you're using, there are all sorts of different ways you can play around with black and white. I was just wanting to try and get in a kind of quick way of doing it. But yes, in the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group, Benedito also put in a couple of versions that he edited of Robert's picture too, with explanations on how he did it. So if you have access to that, well worth going and taking a look. Oh, April's here saying hello everyone. Hi April, glad you can make it. You've come in at the end. But it will be recorded, and well, you can actually watch it on Facebook as soon as we finish here in a few minutes, but at the same time you can have the recorded version will either be on my blog or on YouTube by tomorrow afternoon. And Stacey says, I recently took photos of my niece on her birthday. She did a pose, but when she opened her gifts, it was much better. Yeah, again, it's that thing of, it's always great to try and capture kids acting, naturally, but sometimes you do want the portrait. Sometimes you do want the engagement with the camera. And so that's what we were talking about. Cool. Right, well, that pretty much brings us to the end, unless anybody else has got any immediate comments they want to bring in. If you've enjoyed, found this useful, then do consider supporting via buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. And next week, we are going to do the silhouette challenge. So, as I was talking about at the beginning of this podcast, I was talking about silhouettes, how they work, why they can be engaging, things you can do with them. What I want to do now is see what you're going to do with silhouettes. We'll have the silhouette challenge. I'll set up an event page in the next day or two, and you can either post your images into the event page on Facebook or put them into the Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. If you are watching this on YouTube, you would still like to take part, but you're not a part of Facebook, then just email me your images with a little note letting me know. Let me know a little bit of the story behind the image, why you've taken this, what it is, and why you took it, what drew you to taking that photo. Because I think the stories behind the photos can be just as fascinating as the photos themselves, especially at this point of what we're doing. The point of the challenge, I'm not going to be doing critique really next week, unless somebody specifically asks me for feedback on a specific photo. Really, the whole idea of this is about, the challenge is about sharing your ideas. Go out there, take your ideas. We've got however many people are watching this, everybody's got a slightly different take on it. You will all do something different. And that's the wonder of photography, and that's the wonder of having a community of photographers, and where we can share the way we see the world. One of the things I love about photography is that the uniqueness of everybody's interpretation. We all see the world in a slightly different way. What attracts us to, we might, even if we're photographing exactly the same thing, we will all have our slightly different take on it. We'll want a slightly different angle. We'll want to edit it in a slightly different way. We'll decide that some aspect of that image is more important than what somebody else would have thought was more important. So when we come to the challenge, do a silhouette. Let me know what it is about the photo, why you took it, and what you found interesting about it. Any interesting little anecdote that might have gone along with it. Put it into the group. We'll just stick with one each, and then next week what I'll do is I will share the images. We'll go through them together, comment on them, give feedback, have a chat, and inspire each other. Which is a chance to be inspired by what other people are doing, and maybe put in something yourself which somebody else goes, oh, that's interesting, I hadn't thought of doing it that way. And that is just wonderful. That to me is what this Understanding Photography by Kim Ayres group is all about, really. So with that in mind, thank you very much for your time. Thank you to everybody who has submitted something, turned up, left a comment, said hello, or even lurked in the background. Jackie says thanks a million. Michelle says thank you, Kim. I will catch up on YouTube with what I missed. Cool. Okay. That's us. Look forward to seeing you next week, and really looking forward to seeing what you will submit for the Silhouette Challenge. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.